The Denver skyline shimmered beneath the crisp October sun in 2023 as Abigail Hart, a 32-year-old data strategist with a quiet brilliance, sat in her modest office at Hart Innovations. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, quarterly reports glowing on the screen. 3 years of outperforming every other department, silently powering the company's success. Without warning, Greg Voss stormed in, bold, loud, and arrogant, his cheap tie flapping, voice booming. "Abigail, we're done here," he sneered, slapping a pink slip onto her desk. He called her useless, just a spreadsheet drone, unfit to lead. But what he didn't know was that Abigail was the backbone of it all, and far more than just another middle manager. Calmly, she met his gaze, shook his hand, and watched him walk away, unaware of the secret her late father had hidden for years. On her 31st birthday just 2 weeks earlier, Abigail learned she owned 90% of Hart Innovations, a legacy kept quiet until the perfect moment. And that moment had finally arrived. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. This Denver story is about to explode with betrayal, revenge, and a comeback you'll never forget. America, don't miss what happens next. 2 weeks before Abigail Hart was blindsided by her termination, Denver was painted in shades of amber and rust. Leaves tumbled lazily down the quiet streets, and the air carried a crispness that whispered of endings and new beginnings. Inside the old Victorian house, where she'd grown up, Abigail sat alone in her father's leather armchair, the weight of autumn pressing against the windows. Her 31st birthday was approaching, but this year would be different. Resting on her lap was a thick envelope, its surface stamped with the insignia of Pierce & Lyle, the family's long-trusted law firm. She'd found it earlier that morning in her mailbox, marked, "To be opened on or after October 3rd. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter in her father's unmistakable script, strong, angular, and full of purpose, and a bundle of legal documents that would change everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. The letter began with a simple line. "Abigail, if you are reading this, then I've finally decided it's time you knew the truth." Her eyes scanned the rest, her heart pounding louder with each word. Her father, Thomas Hart, had built Hart Innovations from the ground up, pouring his life's work into it, but behind his calm leadership was a quiet promise that someday his daughter would inherit more than just his name. Enclosed was proof, a legally binding trust document that transferred 90% of the company's shares to her, effective immediately upon her 31st birthday. It was all signed, notarized, and validated. There was no ambiguity. Thomas had planned it meticulously. He had watched her grow, seen her dedication, her humility, her relentless work ethic, and decided she was the future, not those who grabbed the spotlight, not the executives with polished resumes and shallow ambitions. He'd kept it hidden, waiting for the moment she would be ready, for the moment she would need it most. Abigail reread the letter twice. At first, she couldn't speak. Then she laughed, softly, disbelievingly, and tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming clarity. She wasn't crazy for thinking she had value. She wasn't naive to believe her work mattered. Her father had seen her, truly seen her, and he had bet the future of his life's work on her shoulders. As the late afternoon sun bathed the living room in gold, she reached for her phone and dialed Daniel Pierce. He picked up on the first ring. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady. "Is this real?" He chuckled warmly, the way a family friend might when watching a child open a long-awaited gift. "It's very real, Abigail. Your father made sure of that." She exhaled slowly, the full scope of her new reality settling in. She wasn't just a former department head anymore. She was the majority owner of Hart Innovations, and the people who had dismissed her as insignificant had no idea what was coming. That evening, she sat on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders and a mug of tea growing cold in her hands. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the occasional bark of a distant dog and the crunch of leaves beneath passing footsteps. Abigail thought about all the years she had spent putting her head down, getting the work done, letting others take the credit. convincing herself that patience was a virtue and humility a strength. She had endured condescension, underestimation, and blatant disregard, not just from Greg Voss, but from nearly everyone at the top. She'd smiled through meetings where her ideas were repeated by someone else and praised as genius. She'd watched lesser performers be promoted while she stayed in the trenches, holding the company together with little recognition. And now, in the quiet of her childhood home, she understood why her father had waited. He had known this moment would come. He had known that when the betrayal hit, it wouldn't break her. It would forge her. She wasn't angry. She was focused. The next morning, Abigail drove to a quiet cafe near the edge of town, the same cafe where her father used to take her for hot chocolate on snowy Sundays. She brought the documents with her, reviewing them again while sipping black coffee. It all checked out. No loopholes, no room for Greg or anyone else to contest it. With her signature, she could activate her voting rights and begin the process of reshaping the company from the inside out. She texted Daniel, "I'm ready to move forward. Let's set the wheels in motion." He responded almost immediately, "I'll schedule the shareholder meeting. You'll have your moment, Abigail." She smiled. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about justice, about restoring integrity to a company that had lost its way, about honoring her father's legacy with action, not just sentiment. Back at home, she opened her laptop and began outlining a plan, not for revenge, but for resurrection. She listed the departments that needed immediate audits, the toxic managers that had to be removed, the employees she wanted to promote, the ones who'd worked quietly, like she had, without recognition. She wasn't just going to take over, she was going to rebuild, and she would start with a clean sweep. The title didn't matter to her. The corner office didn't matter either. What mattered was returning Hart Innovations to the culture of trust and innovation that her father had nurtured. She could hear his voice in her mind, steady and wise. Lead with heart, not ego. That's what she would do. As night fell over Denver, Abigail stood by the window of her bedroom, looking out at the distant skyline. Somewhere in those gleaming buildings, Greg was probably celebrating her departure, toasting to what he believed was a final victory. She wondered how he would react when he saw her walk into the next board meeting, not as a disgruntled ex-employee, but as the majority shareholder with the legal right to reshape the company at its core. That moment would come soon enough. For now, she allowed herself a small smile and whispered to the empty room, "You made the wrong bet, Greg, but I'm glad you did." The fuse had been lit, and she was ready for the firestorm to come. The day of the shareholder meeting arrived with a soft drizzle blanketing Denver in a gray hush. As if the city itself were holding its breath, Abigail stood in front of the mirror, buttoning a navy blue blazer her mother had once gifted her, the fabric stiff with significance. She wasn't dressing to impress. She was dressing to signal that the days of her silence were over. At precisely 8:45 a.m., she walked into the Hart Innovations headquarters for the first time since her termination. The front desk receptionist looked up, startled, but Abigail gave a polite nod and kept moving. Her heels clicked confidently on the marble floors as she passed the portraits of former CEOs, including her father's. She paused briefly at his framed image, offering a respectful nod before stepping into the executive elevator. She had called this meeting through her legal rights as majority shareholder, and no one could deny her place at the table now. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Greg Voss sat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by his usual circle of enablers, executives who had thrived under his rule of fear and favoritism. His face froze when he saw Abigail walk in, her shoulders squared, a leather folder tucked beneath her arm. He stood up slightly, as if unsure whether to greet her or call security, but she beat him to it. "Good morning, everyone," she said calmly. "I believe you've all received the updated shareholder documents. If not, I've brought additional copies." She handed them to the assistant at the end of the table, who began distributing them without a word. Greg's face reddened. "Abigail, this isn't—" She cut him off gently but firmly. "Greg, I suggest you take a moment to read. It'll explain why this meeting is no longer under your control. As the others scanned the paperwork, their expressions shifted, some with disbelief, others with growing concern. The documents were irrefutable. Abigail Hart now owned 90% of the company's shares, and with that, held the majority voting power on all corporate decisions. She could hire, fire, restructure, and override any previous executive decision. The silence in the room became suffocating. Greg leaned back in his chair, trying to compose himself. "This is a mistake. Your father never—" "He did," Abigail said, her voice steady. "And he trusted Daniel Pierce to safeguard those wishes until the time was right. That time is now." The room remained still as she opened her folder and began laying out her plans. This company used to be a place of innovation and respect, but in the past few years, it's become something else, something toxic. My father believed in lifting people up, not stepping on them. So today, we begin a new chapter. She glanced around the table. Effective immediately, I'm reinstating several department leaders who were demoted or pushed out under questionable circumstances. I'm launching an internal audit of HR and financial departments. And Greg, you are hereby relieved of your duties as CEO. The words landed like a thunderclap. Greg shot to his feet. "You don't have the authority." "I do," Abigail said, pulling out the final page. A notarized resolution, with her signature and Daniel Pierce's official verification. "You're welcome to challenge it in court, but I assure you, you'll lose." For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the board members, a quiet woman named Evelyn who had once mentored Abigail early in her career, cleared her throat. "It's time," she said simply. "We've needed change for a long time." Slowly, others nodded in agreement. Greg's mouth opened, but no words came. Eventually, he grabbed his briefcase and walked out without another word. Abigail didn't watch him go. She was too busy outlining what came next. By the end of the meeting, Abigail had appointed a temporary leadership team composed of employees known for integrity and collaboration. She reinstated the company's ethics hotline and scheduled town halls with each department. She didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she made it clear that honesty, accountability, and respect were no longer optional. That afternoon, she walked the floors of the company like she used to, greeting old colleagues, listening to concerns, making notes. Some people stared in disbelief, others offered shy smiles, and a few came up with tears in their eyes to say, "Welcome back." In the break room, someone had scrawled, "She's back," on a whiteboard and left out cupcakes with blue icing. Abigail chuckled when she saw them. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. She wasn't just changing titles and policies. She was reviving a spirit that had been buried under years of corporate rot. Later that evening, she sat across from Daniel Pierce in his office, the Denver skyline stretching wide behind him. "You handled it better than I ever expected," he said, sipping tea from a chipped mug. Abigail smiled faintly. "I didn't think I could until I did." He nodded. "Your father would be proud." She looked out at the city lights, her voice softer now. "He carried so much on his shoulders. I wish he'd shared more with me when he was alive." Daniel leaned forward. He wanted to, but he also wanted to see what kind of leader you would become on your own, not just because of a title or a name, but because of who you are. That hit her deeper than she expected. She looked down at her hands, remembering all the nights she stayed late, all the mornings she arrived before sunrise, the weekends she sacrificed, the ideas she submitted without credit. It had all led to this, a rebirth, not just for the company, but for herself. As she left Daniel's office and stepped into the cool night air, Abigail didn't feel triumphant. She felt grounded, empowered, clear. This wasn't the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a long journey to rebuild something worthy. And she was ready to walk it, step by step. Hart Innovations wasn't just hers now. It belonged to every unsung worker who had ever been ignored, to every voice that had gone unheard. She would make sure they were heard, seen, and respected, just like her father had once seen her. In the weeks that followed Abigail's return to Hart Innovations, the company's atmosphere shifted in ways that were both subtle and profound. The quiet dread that had once hovered in hallways was replaced with cautious optimism. Employees spoke more freely, and meetings that had previously been stiff and performative became genuine discussions. Abigail made it a point to spend time with each department, often pulling up a chair in staff meetings, asking questions, and listening without interrupting. She wasn't there to micromanage. She was there to rebuild trust, and trust, she knew, had to be earned slowly, one honest action at a time. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Rumblings of discontent began surfacing from a few former allies of Greg Voss, who remained in middle management roles. They whispered about Abigail's inexperience, her emotional leadership, and how she was undoing years of structure. One of them, a man named Troy Benning, had served as VP of Operations under Greg and had thrived in the old regime by keeping people in fear. He was still in his role, temporarily, but Abigail had kept a close eye on his behavior. Her instincts told her he would resist the new direction, and she was right. Within 2 weeks, he was caught attempting to manipulate internal audit reports to cover up a misallocation of department funds. When confronted, he claimed it was a clerical error, but the evidence said otherwise. Abigail terminated him that same day and held a company-wide meeting to explain why. "Transparency only works if we live it," she said calmly into the microphone in the main auditorium. "We will make mistakes, but we will not lie about them, and we will not tolerate cover-ups, no matter how high someone sits." The message was received loud and clear. Her willingness to act decisively sent shockwaves through the ranks, not out of fear, but out of a growing respect. People began to believe she meant what she said. Meanwhile, Abigail had quietly hired a new HR director named Valerie Monroe, a seasoned professional with a reputation for resolving conflicts and championing inclusion. Valerie immediately implemented new reporting protocols and offered every employee access to a confidential ethics liaison. Morale began to shift further upward. But even as things inside the company improved, external pressures loomed. A business blog leaked word that Hart Innovations had removed Greg Voss and reinstated the founder's daughter. The headlines were mixed, some calling it a bold new era, others dismissing it as nepotism. Investors grew jittery. One morning, Abigail received notice that a group of minority shareholders, some of whom had backed Greg, were filing a motion to block her policy changes. They were accusing her of emotional decision-making and jeopardizing the company's competitive edge. It was a strategic move, clearly meant to scare her into backing off. Abigail's first instinct was to react with fire, to call a press conference, go on the offensive. But Daniel Pierce advised caution. "Don't swing just because they threw a punch," he said. "Sometimes strength is measured in how you stand, not how you strike." So Abigail did what she knew best. She turned to facts, not fear. She assembled her legal team, provided full documentation of every change made under her leadership, and compiled early data showing positive employee retention trends, a drop in compliance complaints, and a modest uptick in productivity. She then requested a meeting with the shareholders who filed the motion and presented her case calmly, with full transparency. Her closing remark was simple. "You can invest in fear, or you can invest in a future where people want to work here again." To her surprise, 2 of the shareholders withdrew their support for the motion afterward. The others didn't, but they were clearly rattled by her preparedness and professionalism. The motion failed in committee. Abigail had won not by overpowering them, but by outlasting their noise with quiet strength. That victory, however, came with a personal cost. The stress of constant scrutiny and internal reform began taking a toll on her health. She often stayed at the office past midnight, skipping meals, sleeping only a few hours a night. One evening, Daniel found her asleep on the floor of her office, papers scattered around her like fallen leaves. He gently woke her and said, "You can't rebuild the company if you break yourself in the process." It was a truth she needed to hear. That weekend, Abigail forced herself to rest. She turned off her phone, took a walk around her childhood neighborhood, and visited her mother's grave for the first time in years. Standing there, she whispered an apology for being absent so long, then a quiet promise. I'm not just doing this for Dad. I'm doing it for both of you. When Monday came, Abigail returned with a clearer mind. She called a leadership retreat, not at a resort, but at a local community center. She told her top staff, we're not here to strategize profits. We're here to figure out who we want to be as leaders in this new version of Hart. The retreat became a turning point. Executives opened up about fears, hopes, and past mistakes. People cried. People laughed. Bonds were built. By the end of it, they created a new company mission statement together, one that honored the past while welcoming the future. And for the first time in years, people didn't just work for Hart Innovations. They believed in it. That night, Abigail sat in her office with the lights dimmed, sipping tea and looking out at the city below. Denver looked different now, not just because the seasons were changing, but because something inside her had shifted too. She no longer felt like she was standing in her father's shadow. She was building her own legacy now, brick by brick, heart by heart. There was still so much to do, lawsuits to manage, systems to upgrade, leaders to train. But she wasn't alone anymore. The company wasn't just healing, it was learning to hope again. And so was she. Weeks turned into months, and the once fractured corridors of Hart Innovations began to hum with something Abigail hadn't heard in a long time: genuine collaboration. The silence of fear had been replaced by hallway chatter, laughter over coffee, and brainstorming sessions that didn't end in power plays. But even as the culture improved, the ghost of Greg Voss lingered in boardrooms and balance sheets. Though removed, his influence wasn't entirely erased. Old contracts he'd signed with shell companies were surfacing, some riddled with loopholes and hidden liabilities. Abigail realized that cleaning up his mess would take more than policy changes. It would take legal firepower. That's when Daniel introduced her to Morgan Blake, a high-profile corporate attorney known for dismantling the quiet empires of men like Greg. Morgan wasn't flashy. She was composed, deliberate, and known for her ability to untangle knots most lawyers wouldn't touch. When Abigail first met her, she was struck by her calm energy and piercing clarity. "Don't tell me who Greg Voss was," Morgan said flatly as they sat in a small conference room on the 20th floor. "Show me what he left behind." Abigail handed her a thick binder. Morgan spent the next 2 hours flipping pages in silence, occasionally scribbling notes. Then she closed the binder and said, "This wasn't negligence. This was a blueprint for quiet theft." From that moment on, Morgan became a regular presence at Hart. She set up a legal task force, examined every contract signed during Greg's tenure, and uncovered a network of questionable vendors, inflated invoices, and subsidiaries that funneled money into side ventures Greg never disclosed to the board. As the scope of the damage grew clearer, so did the stakes. Abigail couldn't simply fire people anymore. Now she was facing the possibility of federal investigations and shareholder lawsuits. "We need to report this ourselves," she told Morgan one night, after reviewing yet another file filled with damning signatures and backdated approvals. "If we hide any of it, we're no better than him." Morgan nodded. "It's the right move, but make no mistake, it will trigger a storm." And it did. Within days of self-reporting to the SEC, news broke that Hart Innovations was launching a full internal investigation into the former CEO's financial conduct. Media outlets jumped on the story, spinning narratives about scandal and betrayal. Abigail held a press conference to address it directly. Standing behind a wooden podium with the company logo behind her, she looked directly into the cameras and said, "This company was built on integrity, and we're not afraid to confront the truth, even when it's painful. Greg Voss betrayed our trust. But we will fix what was broken, and we will do it the right way." Her honesty won over skeptics, and her willingness to face public scrutiny only deepened support among employees and clients alike. Still, not everyone wanted the truth to come out. Greg's allies, those who had benefited from his shadow deals, began pushing back. Anonymous threats were sent to Abigail's email. Rumors of blackmail circulated. One night, her car tires were slashed in the company garage. Security was increased, and Morgan filed restraining orders against a few former executives who had grown increasingly hostile. Daniel, always watching from the edges, stayed closer than ever. "You know," he said one evening as they walked through a nearly empty office, "your father would be proud, not just of what you're fixing, but of how you're doing it." Abigail smiled weakly. "Sometimes I wish he could see it. Other times, I'm glad he doesn't have to watch it fall apart first." But it wasn't falling apart. It was being reborn. Amidst the legal battles, something unexpected happened. Clients who had distanced themselves during Greg's reign began to return. One longtime partner, a defense contractor, renewed their multi-million-dollar contract and praised Abigail's leadership. A major tech firm requested a joint project proposal. The tide was turning. Then came the subpoena. Greg Voss, from wherever he was hiding, had filed a countersuit, claiming wrongful termination and defamation. It was a desperate move, but one that forced Abigail to sit through depositions, answer invasive questions, and revisit painful memories. Morgan handled most of it, shielding her when possible, but the weight still fell heavy. During one particularly grueling deposition, Greg's lawyer questioned her leadership, her family's legacy, even her qualifications. "Wouldn't you agree," the lawyer sneered, "that your emotional attachment to this company clouds your judgment?" Abigail paused, then replied calmly, "My emotional attachment is what drives me to protect this company. What clouds judgment is unchecked power and silence in the face of wrongdoing. We've seen what that looks like." Morgan gave her a small nod from across the table. That night, exhausted but defiant, Abigail returned to her apartment and found a letter waiting in her mailbox. No return address. Inside, it was a handwritten note on plain stationery. "They tried to bury you," it read, "but they didn't realize you were a seed." She didn't know who sent it, but she kept it taped to her mirror. With each passing week, the case against Greg grew stronger. Former employees came forward, corroborating evidence of misconduct. Anonymous tips poured into the legal hotline. One day, a former accountant revealed that Greg had falsified tax documents to divert funds into a Cayman account. That was the tipping point. The Department of Justice launched an inquiry, and Greg's countersuit was withdrawn quietly. Though he hadn't been arrested yet, the walls were closing in. Abigail didn't celebrate. She simply went back to work. Because for her, this wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoration. About honoring what her father built, not just the company, but the values that had once defined it. On the one-year anniversary of Greg's removal, Hart Innovations held a company-wide event not to mark the scandal, but to celebrate survival. Employees stood and shared stories of what had changed. A young engineer spoke about feeling heard for the first time. A single mother in accounting thanked Abigail for implementing paid family leave. The janitor, who had worked there for 27 years, said simply, "It feels like home again." And when it was Abigail's turn to speak, she said just one sentence, "We're not who we were, but we're becoming who we were always meant to be." The room stood in silence for a moment, then erupted in applause. Abigail stood off to the side afterward, watching people hug, laugh, cry. Daniel came up beside her, holding a glass of sparkling cider. "To surviving the storm," he said. She clinked her glass against his. "No," she replied, "to building after it." The weeks that followed the company's one-year turnaround celebration felt surreal to Abigail. For the first time in what felt like forever, her mornings weren't consumed by crisis meetings or legal emergencies. She could sip her coffee without dread curling in her stomach. Yet, beneath the surface of stability, she knew something unresolved still loomed. Greg Voss hadn't vanished. He had simply gone quiet. And people like Greg never stayed quiet for long. Morgan was still cautiously monitoring the federal investigation, working with regulators, combing through the final set of offshore records. "We're close," she said one afternoon. "One more signature, one more wire transfer. We'll have enough to press criminal charges." Abigail nodded, but didn't allow herself to hope just yet. That evening, she walked into her father's old office, now converted into a quiet archive space. She sat in his chair, ran her fingers along the worn edge of the desk, and whispered, "Almost there, Dad." It was more than just taking back the company. It was taking back her voice, her worth, and every piece of herself that had once been chipped away by fear and silence. Then came the phone call. It was from Jessica. Her voice trembled. "Mom showed up at my dorm today." Abigail froze. What did she want? She said she's been reading the news, that she wants to talk to you. Abigail didn't respond at first. Kayla hadn't contacted her in nearly a year, not since the divorce papers were finalized and custody agreements signed. But now, with Greg nearly cornered and the company on the mend, Kayla resurfaced. "Did she say why?" Abigail asked. Jessica hesitated. "She said she has something you need to know. About Greg. About everything." That night, Abigail lay awake, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. Kayla had always been complicated, charming when she wanted to be, cold when crossed. But if she knew something that could close the final door on Greg's chapter, Abigail had no choice but to listen. Against Morgan's advice, she agreed to meet her ex-wife at a quiet restaurant outside the city. Kayla arrived wearing oversized sunglasses and a long coat, as if hiding from a camera crew that wasn't there. She sat without ordering anything, leaned forward and whispered, "He contacted me." Abigail blinked. "Greg?" Kayla nodded. 3 weeks ago, he said if I helped him bury a few documents, he'd make sure I got a share of the trust he's hiding." Abigail's stomach turned. "Did you?" "Of course not," Kayla snapped. "I'm not that desperate, but I did record the call." From her purse, she pulled out a small flash drive and slid it across the table. "He mentions bank names, dates, even one of the dummy corporations you and your lawyer are chasing. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you, but I don't want Jessica growing up thinking I did nothing." Abigail took the flash drive in silence. "Why now, Kayla?" Her ex-wife looked away. "Because for once, I wanted to do the right thing." Back in her car, Abigail sat in the parking lot and called Morgan. "I have something. You're going to want to hear this." The next day, Abigail, Morgan, and a federal investigator listened to the recording in a sealed conference room. Greg's voice was unmistakable, arrogant, rehearsed, confident in his ability to twist people into accomplices. But what he didn't realize was that this time he'd spoken too freely. The recording confirmed the existence of multiple offshore accounts and detailed how he'd used certain legal loopholes to funnel money through holding companies. It was damning. Morgan leaned back in her chair when the recording ended. "This is it," she said. "We have enough." Within 48 hours, a sealed indictment was issued. The following week, Greg Voss was arrested at a private airfield outside Chicago, trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. The news broke instantly. Headline after headline reported the dramatic downfall of the once celebrated CEO who had almost gotten away with it all. Abigail watched the coverage from her office, feeling a mix of relief, sadness, and a strange, quiet victory. But victory didn't mean closure. Not yet. After Greg's arrest, former employees came forward in greater numbers. Some confessed their roles, others apologized. The board, once divided, unanimously voted to back Abigail's reforms permanently. And yet, something in her still felt unresolved, until the day Jessica showed up at her office. "You never told me what happened between you and Mom," she said quietly. Abigail sighed, gesturing to the couch. "It's not a simple story," she said. "We were good at pretending. But the truth is, your mom and I stopped being a team long before the divorce. She resented how much time I gave to the company, and I resented how much she pulled away from everything that mattered to me. When Greg started getting too close, I think she saw in him what she wished I could be. Less obsessed, more relaxed, more attentive. But she didn't see the monster underneath." Jessica looked down at her hands. "Do you hate her?" "No," Abigail said softly. "I hate the choices she made, but I understand why she made them. People fall apart in private before the world ever sees the cracks. In the months that followed, Hart Innovations entered what the press dubbed the Renaissance phase. Under Abigail's leadership, the company launched 3 new initiatives, one focused on sustainability, one on tech education for underserved communities, and one in honor of her father, a mentorship program for women in leadership. Employees began referring to the new headquarters as Abigail's house, a nod to her tireless commitment to rebuilding from the inside out. At the company's annual shareholders meeting, attendance doubled from the previous year. When Abigail took the stage, applause erupted. She didn't give a long speech. Instead, she said, "Thank you for not giving up on us. And more importantly, thank you for not giving up on the truth." After the meeting, Daniel approached her. "I think your father would have smiled today." Abigail nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe he'd just say, 'Told you it wouldn't be easy.'" They laughed, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't laughter meant to mask exhaustion. It was real. That night, Abigail sat on her apartment balcony, a glass of wine in one hand and the city lights twinkling below. She thought about everything: the betrayals, the lawsuits, the quiet victories. Most of all, she thought about Jessica, about Kayla, about how sometimes families break and don't always mend in the ways we expect. But there's beauty in what's rebuilt, in what survives. She pulled out her phone and opened the photo she kept at the top of her gallery. Her, Jessica, and her father, taken long before any of the chaos began. She smiled. "We made it," she whispered. And this time, she meant it. 6 months after Greg's arrest, life had begun to settle into something that resembled normalcy for Abigail. The public spectacle had faded into history, relegated to business school case studies and true crime podcasts. Most people moved on, chasing the next scandal, the next headline. But Abigail wasn't interested in headlines anymore. She was interested in healing. The company was running smoothly, and her team no longer lived in fear of what might be lurking in the background. Still, there were scars, wounds from years of manipulation, betrayal, and silence that didn't heal overnight. One morning, as she prepared to leave for the office, her phone buzzed with a message from Morgan. "You should see this." Attached was a link to a news article. A judge had officially sentenced Greg Voss to 12 years in federal prison, citing gross abuse of power and financial fraud. Abigail read the piece twice, not because she didn't believe it, but because, for the first time, it felt like a period had finally been placed at the end of a very long sentence. That same day, Abigail received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the return address, a federal prison in upstate New York. She recognized the slanted, rigid handwriting instantly. It was from Greg. She hesitated before opening it, debating whether to rip it in half or hand it straight to Morgan. But curiosity, and perhaps a deeper desire for closure, won out. The letter was short. "Abigail," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted to say thank you for not letting me get away with it. You did what I never believed you could do. You won, and that's something even I can respect." Greg. She folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, setting it in the bottom drawer of her desk. There was no satisfaction in his words, no redemption in his confession, but there was something else: finality. Later that week, Jessica came home for spring break. Abigail picked her up from the train station, and they drove home listening to old music, singing along like they used to before the storm hit their lives. At dinner, Jessica leaned across the table and asked, "Do you think we'll ever be a family again? You, me, and Mom?" Abigail took a deep breath. "Not the way we were, but maybe a different kind of family, one that understands the past but doesn't live in it." Jessica nodded slowly, as if weighing every word. "She's trying, you know," she said. "She started therapy. She even wrote me a letter." Abigail was quiet for a moment, then smiled faintly. "That's good. Everyone deserves a second chance, even her." It wasn't easy, but forgiveness never was. It wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about choosing to move forward anyway. In May, Hart Innovations hosted a gala for its new mentorship program, named after Abigail's father, the Robert Hart Foundation. The ballroom was filled with young entrepreneurs, investors, and journalists. Abigail stood near the edge of the room, a glass of sparkling water in hand, watching as lives were being shaped in real time. Daniel approached her, smiling. "I remember when you hated these kinds of events," he said. Abigail chuckled. "I still do, but this one feels different." "Because it's yours," he replied. "And because no one here is pretending anymore." As the evening wore on, Morgan joined them, raising her glass. "To truth," she said, "and to the women who refused to be silenced." They clinked glasses, a quiet, powerful moment between three people who had fought battles few ever truly understood. Later that night, Abigail stood on stage to deliver her speech. She looked out at the crowd and saw faces full of hope, curiosity, and courage. "When I was younger," she began, "I believed that success meant control. That if I could just work hard enough, plan carefully enough, I could keep life from falling apart. But life doesn't work that way. It's messy. People disappoint you. People betray you. And sometimes, you lose more than you think you can bear. But what I've learned is that real success isn't about control. It's about resilience. It's about getting back up, even when everything inside you wants to stay down. And it's about using your voice, even when others would rather you stay quiet. So tonight, I don't just stand here as a CEO. I stand here as a survivor. And I want every woman in this room to know, you are more powerful than you've been led to believe." The applause that followed wasn't loud out of obligation. It was loud because it came from people who understood every word. In the weeks after the gala, Abigail finally made a decision she'd been postponing for months. She sold the apartment she'd shared with Kayla, the last physical tie to a version of her life that no longer existed. She moved into a small but elegant brownstone across the river, closer to the office, with a cozy rooftop garden where she could read, write, and just be. It wasn't extravagant, but it was hers. Jessica visited often, and sometimes they cooked together, laughing at old memories and awkward recipes. Slowly, the pain of the past was giving way to something else. Peace. One Saturday afternoon, Abigail received an unexpected visitor. It was Kayla. She stood at the doorstep, no makeup, wearing jeans and a simple cardigan. She looked human. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. Abigail stepped aside, and they sat on the rooftop, the city humming quietly beneath them. Kayla didn't launch into excuses. She didn't deflect or dramatize. "I hurt you," she said plainly. "And I didn't just betray you. I betrayed our daughter. I let someone into our lives who nearly destroyed everything. I can't take it back, but I'm sorry." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. "I know," she replied, "and I think that matters more than you realize." They sat in silence for a while, two women who had once shared love, then loss, now something like understanding. As the sun set, Kayla stood. "I'll keep trying," she said. "Not for you. For Jessica." Abigail nodded. "That's all I ever wanted." That night, Abigail pulled out a blank journal and wrote a single sentence on the first page. "The hardest battles are the ones fought in silence, but they are also the ones that shape who we become." She closed the journal, exhaled deeply, and allowed herself to believe something she hadn't dared believe in a long time, that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind her.